Tonight at 10, the evacuation of Aleppo is underway. Thousands of Syrians are expected to be brought out in the days ahead. A long line of buses took civilians and rebel fighters through streets destroyed by months of bombing. Some struck a defiant note as they left.
We left with honour and dignity. Aleppo was completely burned. Yesterday they bombed us with all kinds of weapons.
A fleet of ambulances brought out the sick and injured as President Assad declared this a day of history for the Syrian nation.
History is being written today by every single citizen of Syria. We're not starting to write this history today. The start was 6 years ago when the war began.
We'll have the latest and we'll be asking what the fall of Aleppo means for the wider Syrian conflict. Also tonight, a plan to increase funding for social care in England, including allowing local authorities to bring forward increases in council tax. Theresa May at the European Summit dismisses a warning it could take 10 years to negotiate a trade deal with the EU after Brexit. Britain becomes the first country in the world to approve the creation of babies using DNA from 3 people. And unveiling the glory of the cave paintings of southwest France, but all is not quite as it seems.
In the south, 20 years for the former teacher who raped and sexually assaulted young girls in the 1970s. And an investigation's underway after a serious fire overnight at a motorway service station.
Good evening. The fragile ceasefire in Aleppo is still in place, and the rebel areas in the east of the city are being steadily evacuated. More than 1,000 people have been brought out today after a month under siege, and a Red Cross official said she'd never seen such levels of human suffering. President Assad declared it a moment of history for Syria, but the Americans have accused him of carrying out a massacre in the city of Aleppo, as our correspondent Quentin Somerville reports now.
In Aleppo, here was a fight that tore a city apart and split a nation. Today, this battle ended with a convoy of white flags, and cautiously, eastern Aleppo began to empty. In their thousands, rebel fighters, the sick and the injured were transported away. Nearby, government supporters rejoiced. They praised God, Syria, and Bashar al-Assad. The most desperate were the first to leave. The fear and the anxiety showed. Their rebellion is over, but before they reached relative safety, there was one final journey across enemy lines. The ambulances didn't get far.
As they prepared to evacuate civilians from besieged Aleppo, the ambulance convoy was shot by the regime forces. We're having to move so that we don't get shelled or bombed.
And then panic. As Syrian government jets flew overhead, people feared an attack. In the first convoy, the ambulance driver here was badly wounded, but he'll make it. One of his passengers, though, was killed. Hope is precarious here. The ceasefire had already collapsed once, but more buses set off and made it through. In the rebel-held countryside, on arrival they chanted, "Aleppo, we will be back."
The road was full of Russians, Iranians and Hezbollah fighters. There was no Syrian army at all. We left with honour and dignity. Aleppo was completely burned. Yesterday they bombed us with all kinds of weapons.
Here there was relief. Young and old, almost 3,000 made it out. Among them, rebel fighters, their defeat all too apparent. You can't call this peace, but Aleppo was calm today. The city has fallen around them. Rebel commanders say it's defeat but not surrender, and that their opposition will continue far from here. In West Aleppo, the raising of the Syrian flag perhaps had special significance today. The country's largest city is now mostly back under government control.
History is being written today by every single citizen of Syria. We're not starting to write this history today. The start was 6 years ago when the war began.
And this is where the displaced will go, to rebel-held Idlib, where in already overstretched camps, they're promising to make room.
When we heard that our trapped brothers in Aleppo were going to leave, we had a meeting, and because we don't have spare tents, we asked families to share so we could provide tents to our brothers from Aleppo. There are families and children.
And what remains of East Aleppo? Tens of thousands of people. It will take weeks of convoys to release them. The victory broke Aleppo. It remains a city, but divided, much like the rest of Syria. Before they left, the rebels set alight their headquarters and fuel supplies. And once more, Aleppo burned. Quentin Somerville, BBC News, Istanbul.
Well, as Quentin was saying, the crushing of the rebel enclave in eastern Aleppo represents a major victory for the government of President Bashar al-Assad, which now controls virtually all of the major population centres in Syria. But what impact will the fall of Aleppo have on that wider conflict? Our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen, has this assessment.
This isn't just another broken Middle Eastern city. Aleppo was Syria's biggest. Of the 250,000 people, mainly civilians, who were trapped by the siege of East Aleppo, around 100,000 were children. Only last year, rebels still looked as if they might encircle the regime-held western side of the city. Now, their hopes are as smashed as the streets. As the guns fell silent, Russian troops helped civilians near the TV cameras. Moscow rejects the accusation made by Britain, among others, that its men have been supporting slaughter. The regime's victory is also one for its allies, Russia and Iran. They ignored the condemnation of the siege of East Aleppo by the West, its Arab allies, and the United Nations, who also had no say in the evacuation deal.
It is an agreement that has been made in direct talks between the parties to this war. We were not part of it, and we were only invited this morning to monitor.
These were anti-Assad rebels in Aleppo earlier this year. The fighting groups facing the president have formed shifting coalitions, ranging from men supported by the West and their Arab allies to jihadists close to al-Qaeda. For the regime and its allies, they are all terrorists. East Aleppo's defense was fatally compromised when rebels concentrated on fighting each other rather than fighting the regime and its allies. The war, though, is not over. Today's evacuation allows fighters and civilians from East Aleppo to be taken to rebel-held Idlib province. The regime controls vital strategic routes and big towns, but large chunks of Syria are still held by rebels trying to destroy the regime. As well as that, the jihadists of Islamic State are fighting for their so-called caliphate, recapturing the ancient city of Palmyra this week. In London, the defense secretaries of Britain and the US chose to ignore the failure of their response to President Assad and his allies, who are now stronger in Syria than at any time in the war.
Well, we don't see a future for President Assad in Syria, even if he defeats the opposition in Aleppo.
Thousands more Syrians are leaving eastern Aleppo to become refugees in their own country. More than half Syria's pre-war population has lost homes, jobs, schooling, and sometimes lives. Their suffering crosses borders, and its consequences will continue to be felt in Europe and beyond. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News.
One of the biggest challenges facing society is how to care for the growing numbers of elderly people and how to pay for that care. And the scale of the social care challenge is putting a big financial strain on councils and growing pressure on the NHS. Well, today the government confirmed it would allow local authorities in England to increase council tax by up to 6% over 2 years, specifically to boost funding for social care. It's also creating a new £240 million fund. That's a drop in the ocean, according to the government's critics. Our social affairs correspondent Alison Holt sent this report from Liverpool.
Did anyone do boxing?
This is the front line of social care in Liverpool.
You try and get your arm, that's it.
At the Granby Care Hub, the council and NHS work together to ease pressures on hospitals and provide people with the rehabilitation they need to return home. But here too, they're struggling to cope in a city with high deprivation and an ageing population.
Well done.
It's quite demanding for the beds. As soon as the patient is discharged home, the referrals coming through and within 2 hours we're supposed to sort of have the beds reallocated.
We're looking for 3 calls a day.
Today's government announcement is meant to ease pressures on the care system in England.
I can see that you've sent it out to a number of providers. Is there a particular reason for the hold-up?
But here they believe it'll make little difference to their daily battle to find care companies to provide the support needed to get people home at the price the council pays. 84-year-old Edna is in Granby after weeks in hospital following a fall.
They're not looking at the big picture, are they? If they can't look after the old people, what's going to happen to them? Because some of them, once they don't get anybody to help, will deteriorate, won't they?
Sajid Javid.
Today, as the Community Secretary announced local authorities would be allowed to bring forward planned council tax increases, the 2 men in charge of providing care in Liverpool watched, hoping for more.
In recognition of the immediate challenges that are faced in the care market, we will now allow local councils to raise this funding sooner if they wish. Councils will be granted the flexibility to raise the precept by up to 3% next year and the year after.
Are you kidding? That's an insult.
The government are in effect saying that the areas of greatest demand and greatest need are being left to fend for themselves. The council tax rise is not going to give money to the right places in the country.
The authority already planned to raise council tax by 2% next year, bringing in £3 million extra. Now they can raise an additional 1%, about £1.5 million. But they estimate the shortfall in care funding is £44 million for the year.
I'm not sure how I'm going to be telling this to my staff, to my community, to my providers who supported us all these years.
You seem very upset by this.
I am, because I care. I care about my community.
The government has announced some extra money for areas of high deprivation like Liverpool, but there's an increasing clamour from those who work in health and care for a complete rethink of how we fund support for some of the most vulnerable people in society. Alison Holt, BBC News, Liverpool.
Downing Street has tried to play down concerns that it could take up to a decade to finalise a trade deal between Britain and the European Union after Brexit. The warning was made to ministers in private by the UK's senior diplomat in Brussels, Sir Ivan Rogers. European leaders have been meeting in Brussels today for the final EU summit of 2016, but Theresa May was not at a meeting this evening when the EU's approach to Brexit was being discussed, as our political editor Laura Koonsberg tells us.
Not much small talk between Theresa May and her travel companion today. Behind the tinted windows, alongside her in the official car, Sir Ivan Rogers, our top diplomat in Brussels. As he tried to slip out while the attention was on the boss, they both knew this would be hard.
It's right that the other leaders prepare for those negotiations as we have been preparing. We will be leaving the EU. We want that to be as smooth and an orderly process as possible. It's not just in our interest, it's in the interest of the rest of Europe as well. Thank you.
Could it then take 10 years to get a deal?
10 years? He was trying to stay out of the way, but our ambassador to the EU told ministers in October the consensus here was that it might take as long as a decade to get a trade deal, and in the end, it might even fail. To avoid that, Britain needs friends.
Will it take 10 years for Britain to get a trade deal with the rest of the EU?
10 years? I hope it will be a lot less. I understand how difficult it will be.
for her to negotiate because, of course, she will be negotiating practically against 27.
Not only trade deal, the whole Brexit negotiations will be so very complex.
As one minister said, it's very, very difficult to establish how long it will take, and very difficult for leaders to even find anything in common with one or another when we have voted to leave them all behind. Downing Street told reporters again today here in Brussels and at home it can stick to the 2-year timetable for Brexit, but it is so complicated. Many expect a fallback plan to be in place.
The suggestion is not that it will be 10 years before we leave the EU machine, but that it might take as long as a decade to do a trade deal with the rest of the EU, to work out how we do business after we leave. Ministers want to be more optimistic. They claim it can happen much faster. But are they sticking their fingers in their ears? There's a sense here in Brussels, at least, that we're already on the outside.
Isolated? Theresa May still had a place around this table for talks about Syria, security and defence. But the Prime Minister was not invited to the dinner table when all 27 gathered to work out their tactics for the Brexit talks. Her position is not down to banter and backslapping, but who wouldn't feel a bit awkward on your own in this crowd? Leaving the sober message on Syria. Not a single word on our relations with the EU.
But perhaps the most important issue we discussed was the appalling situation in Syria. We heard from the mayor of eastern Aleppo. He had one plea for us, to allow the safe evacuation of the people in the city.
But after today, if Theresa May was in any doubt, it can be lonely at the top. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Brussels.
Well, let's go live to Brussels tonight. Our Europe editor, Katya Adler, is there. And Katya, what is your sense then of how things have gone there today?
Well, as far as this meeting here tonight, Hugh, perhaps first we should say what it wasn't. It wasn't a snub. It wasn't EU leaders ganging up on the UK. The Prime Minister doesn't invite the EU to her Brexit strategy meetings, and the EU doesn't invite her to theirs. But at this meeting tonight, there were no great plans hatched. It was more about process. EU leaders confirmed the European Commission as their lead Brexit negotiator. It's got the manpower, it's got the expertise, it organises all of the EU trade deals. But make no mistake, Paris and Brussels will never allow the Commission free rein over Brexit. It's become a political football across Europe, and all leaders here tonight are nervous about it. Now, Hugh, they'd have us believe that behind closed doors, harmony reigns. And we do know that they agree that Britain can't remain a full member of the single market if it wants to limit the number of EU citizens living and working in the UK. There was talk here at the summit today about how much it might cost the UK to leave the EU. One Europe minister said up to £50 billion, and we've heard similar figures from the Commission. But there are splits over other issues. Will the UK have to leave the EU before it can negotiate a new trade deal? Privately, EU sources here tell me if the government goes for a hard Brexit, that shouldn't take too long to organise. But the truth is, nobody knows. And real EU divisions and decisions won't become clear until the government decides what kind of Brexit it definitely wants.
All right, Katya, thanks very much once again. Katya Adler there for us, our Europe editor in Brussels at the summit there. Now, Britain is to become the first country in the world to allow the creation of babies using DNA from 3 people. The fertility watchdog, the HFEA, has approved the technique, which uses genetic material from a third person to prevent some inherited diseases. Clinics can now apply for a licence, but the HFEA says it will need to approve every single case for treatment. Our medical correspondent, Fergus Walsh, has been to Newcastle, where the procedure has been pioneered.
Imagine a baby being born with DNA from a man and 2 women. Hannah is a carrier for mitochondrial disease, an often devastating genetic disorder. She now has the chance of a healthy child. Paula is an egg donor, and many more women like her are needed.
My mother's severely affected by mitochondrial disease. She suffered strokes, epilepsy, diabetes and deafness. And as a carrier myself, I could pass that on to my baby, but now we have the option of having a baby and it not being passed on, which is absolutely amazing.
I donated 5 of my eggs for research here at Newcastle, and I've got the knowledge now that I'm helping couples, be able to have healthy children, and it's really fulfilling for me.
Mitochondria are the power packs of cells. They're always inherited from the mother's egg, and when faulty, it means deadly conditions can be passed on. To prevent that, this is how 3-person IVF will work. The nucleus containing the parent's key DNA would be removed, leaving behind the woman's faulty mitochondria. That nucleus is placed into a donor egg from a second woman which has had its key DNA removed and contains only healthy mitochondria. Any child born and future generations would have DNA from 3 people, although only 0.1% from the donor. All the genes that shape appearance and personality would come from the parents. Early next year, the medical team here in Newcastle say they'll be ready to treat the first couples. This is historic but controversial science. Critics will argue that what will happen in this lab is unethical, could be unsafe, and heralds a new era of babies created by design. But Parliament overwhelmingly approved the technique last year, and all the scientific reviews have said it should go ahead. Up to 25 couples a year could be helped, and the treatment will be funded by the NHS.
We believe that the technique will greatly enhance the chances of an affected woman having a healthy baby. And I think this will make an enormous difference to those women, because most of them, they can have babies, but they can't predict whether they will be healthy or seriously affected by disease.
How do we go?
No other country in the world has passed laws allowing 3-person IVF. Hannah and her fiancé Rob hope they will be among the first to be treated. Fergus Walsh, BBC News, Newcastle.
Let's have a brief look then at some of the day's other news stories now. The man accused of killing 9 black parishioners at a church in South Carolina last year has been found guilty of the murders. White supremacist Dylan Roof, who's 22, opened fire on a Bible study group in Charleston. The jury will now decide if he should be sentenced to death. Lambeth Council in South London is to pay compensation to all the children who were in care in the Shirley Oaks Children's Home, whether or not they were abused at the time. The payouts, dating back decades, will cost the council tens of millions of pounds. A group representing those abused say its members suffered child abuse on an industrial scale. The independent directors of the broadcaster Sky have recommended that shareholders accept a takeover offered from 21st Century Fox, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch. Fox already owns 39% of the company. Mr. Murdoch's previous attempt to buy the remainder was abandoned 5 years ago in the wake of the tabloid phone hacking scandal. A 24-hour strike by drivers at Southern Rail will start at midnight after talks aimed at resolving an industrial dispute ended without agreement. Passengers have already suffered 2 days of severe disruption this week because of the dispute over staffing on trains. The governing executive of Northern Ireland has been accused of wasting hundreds of millions of pounds of public money on a controversial green energy scheme. The accusation was made by a former minister, Jonathan Bell, who told the BBC he felt duty-bound to speak out regardless of any damage to his political career. The First Minister, Arlene Foster, has faced calls to resign for her role in the scheme, but she says she has absolutely nothing to hide. Our correspondent Chris Buckler has the story.
Every winter, there are people who worry about heating their homes. But the fuel bill isn't a concern for more than 2,000 businesses in Northern Ireland who are making money every time the boiler's turned on. Among the offices being heated at a taxpayer's expense is this Ferrari and Maserati car showroom in Belfast, all thanks to what's known as the Renewable Heat Incentive Scheme. It is similar to a scheme that operates in other parts of the UK, but there were flaws in the way it was set up in Northern Ireland. In simple terms, unlike elsewhere, there were no caps or limits originally put on payments, and that meant the more you burned, the more you earned. Currently, for every £1 of fuel a company uses, they are paid around £1.60, and those payments have been promised for 20 years. But before the scheme was closed, it was projected to have gone £400 million over budget. Money that Stormont's power-sharing government is responsible for.
Each of us have to act.
Now, the former Enterprise Minister, who was in charge when it spiralled out of control, has accused political advisers within his own party of delaying the decision to close the lucrative scheme.
The special advisers of the DUP interfered in my decision making. I had this to close to a less lucrative rate to keep this manageable.
That's a serious allegation.
The seriousness is terminally ill children are being sent home from hospitals in Northern Ireland because we cannot afford to open a ward. Parents shouldn't be faced with the option of take your child home or we'll place your child 40 miles away. Not while hundreds of millions of pounds can be abused in the worst financial scandal since Northern Ireland has ever existed.
At the time, no one in the DUP could have known the impact of the delay, and its officials deny they interfered. But there is pressure on Mr Bell's longtime friend and party leader, Northern Ireland's First Minister, Arlene Foster. She was the minister responsible when the flawed heating scheme was designed, and the BBC has seen a confidential government report that suggests some businesses are abusing it by heating sheds and buildings just for profit.
Have you had any sleepless nights over this?
No, I haven't, because I'm putting together a plan to deal with this issue. You know, a mark of a politician is not in good times, it's in challenging times. I'm determined to see this through. I'm determined, whilst others walk away, to make sure that we find a solution to all of this.
However, as the DUP fights allegations from within, the heat is growing on both the party and Northern Ireland's First Minister. Chris Buckler, BBC News, Belfast.
And viewers in Northern Ireland can see more on that story. It's at 10:40 tonight on The Nolan Show on BBC One. Now, the Scottish Government has set out its draft budget, the first since new tax powers were devolved to Edinburgh, and it's announced that higher earners will be paying more tax than those elsewhere in the UK. Finance Secretary Derek Mackay said he needed to take a balanced approach, as our Scotland editor Sarah Smith explains.
Trade union protests outside the Scottish Parliament demanding an end to public service cuts sound a little different today, now that Holyrood has far greater power over how much money they can raise from taxes. Inside, a wee pat on the back for the first Scottish Finance Minister who can set income tax rates wherever he likes. Yet he made only a minor change.
We cannot accept, at this time of austerity, top earners benefiting from an inflation-busting tax cut. So I will limit the increase in the higher rate threshold to inflation and not give a substantial real terms tax cut to the top 10% of income earners.
The threshold at which people start paying the 40% tax rate is going up to £45,000 in the rest of the UK. In Scotland, it will only be raised to £43,430. Higher rate taxpayers in Scotland will pay £314 more income tax than someone south of the border, raising the Scottish Government over £120 million a year. There is some new money for schools, a £120 million attainment fund. Of course, the Scottish Government could spend even more if they chose to raise taxes. The Scottish Government will no longer be able to blame problems in the country's schools or anywhere else on budget cuts imposed from Westminster. From now on, if they want to spend more money, they have the power to raise it themselves. Parents in Glasgow say they would pay more for better schools.
I think education is the most important thing, and if it means that we invest more in our kids, I think that's a great use of money.
I don't understand why there's such a big deal about paying tax, especially 1 or 2 pence in a pound.
But in Parliament, Scottish Tories argued higher taxes would hurt the economy.
This will make Scotland the highest tax part of the United Kingdom, and as it stands, this is not a budget we can support.
Labour argued the SNP were not making use of their new tax powers.
They could have asked the richest 1% to pay a little more with a 50p top rate of tax, but yet again they refused to do the right thing.
The SNP fought hard to get to set income tax rates in Scotland. Today they made rather cautious use of their newfound powers. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Edinburgh.
The Lascaux cave network in southwest France was discovered by chance by a schoolboy back in 1940. But for more than half a century, the caves with their Paleolithic paintings have been closed to the public to try to protect the complex from any damage. Well, today, after many years of painstaking work, a full-scale replica has been opened to the public, as our science correspondent Rebecca Morell tells us.
This is some of the world's most important prehistoric art. The Lascaux cave paintings provide a glimpse into the lives of our ancestors 17,000 years ago. And now they're on show to the public for the first time in more than half a century. But this isn't the real thing. It's a €66 million replica. The cave and its art has been recreated in remarkable detail.
The paintings here are accurate copies to the millimetre of the original paintings in the caves. That's why the emotion is there. When you see the animals up above us which gallop and jump, it's really moving.
These teenagers discovered the original Lascaux cave in the southwest of France in 1940. It was soon opened up for visitors, but the once pristine environment became contaminated. Mould and bacteria damaged the art beyond repair, and in 1963 the authorities were forced to seal it shut. Now archaeologists are doing things differently. Last year I was given extremely rare access to France's Chauvet cave, and to look at these, some of the world's oldest paintings. They're so precious this site has never been opened up, so it too has a recently built replica, allowing visitors to see it for themselves. Now the Lascaux cave copy is also open for business. Archaeologists say replicas are the future for conservation, a way to both protect and promote our ancient history and bring the past to the wider world. Rebecca Morell, BBC News.
Well, a quick reminder that Newsnight's about to begin on BBC Two, and here's Evan.
Well, as 2016 draws to a close, and an extraordinary year it's been, we're going to write the first draft of history on it. Is it like the 1930s, or more like the Russian Revolution? 3 historians offer their take. Join me now on BBC Two, 11 p.m. in Scotland.
That's Newsnight with Evan here on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.